Beneath the silent vault of stars, when the known world ended at the edge of the horizon, ancient sailors stared southward, toward darkness, storms, and the unknown. To them, the earth felt incomplete. If there was land in the north, surely there must be balance in the south, a great counterweight of creation, unseen, uncharted, yet believed with conviction. This was the idea of Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a continent born not of discovery, but of imagination, geometry, and desire. Long before European maps took shape on parchment, the Greeks had already spoken of symmetry in the world. Philosophers like Aristotle reasoned that the earth, being spherical, must be balanced. Continents in the north required matching lands in the south. The concept was not myth in their minds, but logic. They called it antichthones, the counter-earth. It was said to lie beneath the known world, beyond the torrid zones where no man could live, scorched by the equatorial sun. But through centuries, as trade and empire grew, this theoretical balance would be redrawn into something tangible. A vast southern continent, waiting to be found. The first maps that hinted at Terra Australis appeared in the age when the Mediterranean was still the center of the world. Claudius Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century AD, compiled knowledge of lands from Iberia to India, but at the bottom of his maps he left a solid mass of land, an imagined barrier stretching beneath Africa and Asia, enclosing the Indian Ocean like a bowl. It was not proof, but philosophy inked into geography. For over 1,000 years, Ptolemy's vision defined how Europe imagined the earth. When the Middle Ages dawned, faith replaced geometry as the compass of exploration. Yet the southern land endured in the minds of mapmakers. Medieval mappa mundi, circular visions of creation, showed Eden at the top, Jerusalem at the center, and beneath, at the very bottom, a great land beneath the sea, the shadow of the world. It was not drawn from sight, but from the need for order, a balance of heaven and earth, of north and south, of known and unknown. As the Renaissance rose and the age of discovery unfurled, that shadow began to take form. The 15th and 16th centuries changed everything. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, their voyages did more than redraw coastlines. They erased the fear of the world's edge. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were no longer barriers, but highways of curiosity. Yet, even as the Northern Hemisphere filled with discoveries, the southern one grew more mysterious. When maps of Africa, Asia, and the Americas began to take shape, cartographers still left vast white spaces below them and filled those blanks with imagination. In 1513, the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis drew his famous world map on gazelle skin, combining knowledge from Arab sailors, Portuguese explorers, and older sources. At its southern edge, below South America, lies a sweeping landmass, drawn long before anyone had reached Antarctica. To some, it looked like a hint of an ancient southern continent. To others, it was simply artistic symmetry. But to geographers of the time, this shape gave form to what philosophy had always suggested. A great land must exist to balance the earth. Throughout the 16th century, as European empires reached across the seas, mapmakers expanded this vision. The continent acquired names: Terra Australis Incognita, Magellanica, Java la Grande. The Venetian cartographer Oronce Fine, in 1531, published a map that boldly showed a massive southern continent wrapping around the South Pole, connected to lands far beyond sight. His work inspired generations of mapmakers, each adding detail to something no one had seen. In 1570, Abraham Ortelius, creator of the first modern atlas, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, depicted Terra Australis as a vast expanse stretching from Tierra del Fuego to New Guinea. In his elegant Latin script, he described it as a land not yet discovered but believed to exist. a phrase that captured the very essence of the age. Credimus quia desideramus. We believe because we desire. Desire, indeed, was what drove explorers southward. Reports from sailors returning from the Indies, whispers from islands glimpsed through fog, and the lure of wealth, all merged into a single obsession. If such a continent existed, it might hold gold, spices, and kingdoms waiting to be claimed. And so, expeditions were launched into seas where no maps could guide them, chasing coastlines that receded like mirages. In 1520, Ferdinand Magellan, commanding his fleet through the strait that now bears his name, sighted distant snow-capped mountains across the southern waters. He called the inhabitants he believed lived there Patagones, the big-footed people, and thought the lands beyond must form part of the great southern continent. Maps soon followed, marking Terra Australis in sweeping, confident strokes. Yet, what Magellan had seen was not a continent at all, but the rugged tip of South America, stretching toward the frozen seas of the Antarctic Circle. As decades passed, the legend deepened. In 1578, Francis Drake sailed southward, rounding Cape Horn, proving that Tierra del Fuego was not a peninsula, but an island. Yet even this revelation did not destroy the dream of Terra Australis. It only shifted its boundaries further south. The unknown was resilient. Every discovery that disproved one version of the myth only redrew it anew. By the late 16th century, maps had become canvases of conjecture. French, Dutch, and English cartographers competed not only to record new lands, but to imagine those yet undiscovered. Gerardus Mercator, whose projection still defines how we see the world, filled the lower half of his globe with the massive Terra Australis, writing that it was so large that it must needs contain a wealth of provinces and peoples. In his vision, it wrapped around the southern seas like a secret waiting to be revealed. In this era, belief and discovery were intertwined. The more Europe's knowledge expanded, the more space imagination claimed. Terra Australis became both a scientific hypothesis and a symbol of human longing for symmetry, order, and the unknown. The Earth was round, but its story was incomplete. Somewhere beyond the roaring latitudes, a land was waiting to balance the world. And so, explorers set out from Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, and London, following winds that carried them past the limits of their maps. Some found nothing but waves and ice. Others returned with fragments, islands near Java, distant lands near New Guinea, and claimed they were the fringes of the Great South. The dream persisted, gathering the weight of empire, the authority of science, and the allure of myth. As the 17th century approached, the great southern continent had become a fixture of maps and minds alike. It was drawn with mountains, rivers, and kingdoms, peopled with imagined inhabitants. Scholars debated its nature. Some thought it temperate and fertile, others cold and barren. But few doubted it existed. The truth, however, still lay buried beneath the frozen silence of the polar seas, and though the lines inked on vellum looked certain, they were the outlines of an illusion, one that would take centuries to unravel. The North Atlantic was not a void to the Vikings. It was a living path, a restless, breathing expanse they called the Valroder, the Whale Road. To others, it was a barrier of death, a realm of storms and ice where the horizon devoured ships whole. But to the Norse, it was a bridge, a perilous but navigable highway linking the scattered islands of their expanding world. Their longships sliced through the waves like living creatures, their carved dragon prows defying the wrath of gods and sea alike. Each voyage began with ritual, the silent watching of the sky, the wind, and the sea's shifting hue. The old navigators did not have compasses or charts. Instead, they carried in memory the rhythm of waves, the flight of birds, the scent of salt carried by wind, and the shimmer of sunlight on swells. They read the ocean as one reads a sacred text, the rising of the summer sun over the horizon, the fall of constellations like the Swan and the Great Bear. These were their instruments, written not on parchment, but upon the living sky. From the fjords of western Norway, fleets set forth. Sails woven from wool caught the wind like wings of crimson and ochre. Beneath them, the hulls of oak flexed and groaned, their planks bound by iron rivets and tarred sinew. Each ship was an extension of the shore, a fragment of homeland floating over the abyss. Within them, men sang to drive away fear, deep, resonant chants that blended with the roar of the sea. Behind every voyage was the hunger of land too narrow, winters too long, and dreams too vast to be confined to a single coast. The first landfall came to the north, the Faroe Islands, their cliffs rising sheer and green from the surf. Here the Vikings found grasslands swept by wind and nesting seabirds in uncountable flocks. They built turf houses upon ridges and watched the storms roll from the west. But beyond these islands, stories whispered of an even greater land, one shrouded in mist, a place where ice met fire. By the late 9th century, Iceland emerged from myth into the Norse horizon. It was not discovered by design, but by the accidents of storm and drift. Some said it was Nadod, blown off course on his way to the Faroe Islands, who first sighted the eastern fjords. Others credited Gardar Svavarsson, who circumnavigated the island and proved it was land entire. Yet it was Floki Vilgerdarson, remembered simply as Hrafna Floki, Floki of the Ravens, who gave it its enduring name. He released his sacred birds into the wind, and they flew northwest, guiding him to the place of smoke and frost. When he saw the ice filling the northern bays, he called it Island, Iceland, the land of ice. To many, the name was a warning. To the Vikings, it was a challenge. Within a generation, hundreds of ships crossed from Norway, filled with families, livestock, and relics of their homeland. They came not merely as raiders, but as settlers seeking a freer world beyond the reach of kings. The sagas tell of noble families fleeing the tightening rule of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first unifier. Here, on this volcanic island at the world's edge, they found valleys of black rock and ash, and pastures that glowed green in the brief northern summer. The Icelandic landscape shaped their souls. Beneath their feet, the earth trembled with unseen fires. Geysers hissed steam into the sky. Rivers carved silver veins through moss and lava. And above all, the light, clear, piercing, shifting, moved like a living spirit across mountains and sea. In this place, isolation became identity. Out of the raw silence rose a civilization unlike any in Europe, free of kings, governed by assembly, bound by law and memory. They built the Althing, the world's first national parliament, in a windswept valley called Thingvellir, where rivers split the land apart as if by divine design. Here, justice was spoken aloud under open sky, words carrying as much weight as swords. But Iceland was not the end. It was a frontier, a stepping stone to worlds still unimagined. The Norse heart yearned ever outward. As farms grew and pastures filled, whispers turned toward the west, where sailors claimed to have seen distant coasts and floating ice. Some spoke of Gunnbjörn's skerries, glimpsed by a ship driven far beyond sight of land. The tales spread, uncertain yet irresistible. Beyond Iceland, another land awaited. By the late 10th century, Erik the Red, outlawed from Iceland for bloodshed, turned exile into discovery. He sailed westward into the fog, following the ghost of rumor across 1,500 kilometers of uncharted sea. For 3 years, his ship wandered through ice and storm until the mists parted to reveal a coastline vast and white. Here glaciers descended to the sea like frozen rivers, mountains pierced the clouds, and fjords cut deep into a land as silent as time itself. Erik called it Greenland, Greenland, not for its color, but for its promise. For he hoped the name would lure settlers, just as his words would lure courage from those weary of the old world's confines. And so they came, in ships bearing families, tools, and animals. They built farms along the fjords, where green valleys defied the surrounding ice. Timber was scarce, iron precious, yet they endured. For nearly 5 centuries, Norse life clung to the edge of Greenland. They raised churches from imported stone, carved crosses beside runes, and traded walrus ivory across the Arctic seas. But their world was fragile, dependent on the rhythm of seasons that could shift in a generation. When the climate cooled and the sea roots froze, their settlements fell silent, abandoned to snow and memory. Yet the Norse spirit did not end in Greenland. It reached still farther, into the pages of legend and the edge of the known world. For among those who settled Greenland was Leif, son of Erik the Red, Leifr Erikson, whose curiosity would carry him beyond every horizon his people had known. The sagas tell us that around the year 1000, Leif sailed westward from Greenland, following stories told by a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had once glimpsed unknown lands beyond the ice. Leif gathered a crew, fitted his ship, and set course toward the setting sun. What they found was a sequence of shores, first of barren rock and glaciers, then of forests and mild winds. They named the first Helluland, the land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island. The next Markland, the forested land, Labrador. And finally, they reached a place of rivers, berries, and gentle air, where the grass was green and the days long. They called it Vinland, the land of wine, or perhaps the land of meadows. It was North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. For one fleeting moment, the Norse had crossed from the Old World to the New. They built small camps, timber halls, and storehouses, likely in what we now call Newfoundland. Archaeology has traced their presence at Lons aux Meadows, where remnants of their forges, tools, and dwellings remain. It was not a permanent colony, but a frontier of hope. The farthest reach of a seafaring civilization that had followed the whale road to its end. Back in Europe, few believed such places existed. The sagas preserved them as memory, half history, half myth. Yet in their understated lines, they found land beyond the Great Sea, lies one of humanity's most extraordinary acts. The first crossing of the Atlantic by people who left behind no maps, only courage and story. By the time the medieval world began to awaken from its dark centuries, the Viking Age was fading. Christianity replaced the old gods, kings replaced chieftains, and the once open seas grew patrolled by new empires. Yet the Viking legacy endured not just in conquest, but in connection. They had drawn the threads of Europe together, from Dublin to Kiev, from Greenland to Constantinople. Theirs was not the story of destruction alone, but of transformation, of how a people born from fjords and frost expanded the boundaries of the known world. Their ships became the measure of human daring. Each voyage traced new lines upon the map of human imagination, each sail a banner of the will to explore. When later centuries sent caravels south and west, when compasses replaced ravens and the world's maps blossomed into spheres, the spirit of the Viking voyagers remained silent, enduring, hidden beneath the tides of history. When the sails of the last Norse ships faded into the northern mist, the world changed in silence. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle or decree. It dissolved slowly, like morning frost beneath the rising sun. The fire that had burned in the hearts of raiders, settlers, and explorers did not vanish. It transformed, absorbed into the larger current of European civilization. Yet the marks they left upon land and memory remained. faint as runes weathered by centuries, but indelible. In the lands they once conquered, their names lingered. York from Jorvik, Dublin from Dyflin, Normandy from the Northmen who settled its fields. Across rivers and coasts, Norse words became part of the language of place. Fjord, by, thorp, beck. Every name whispered of water, settlement, or stone, reminders that the Vikings were not merely destroyers, but builders and navigators who reshaped the geography of Europe. The tides of history moved on, but their wake still traced the contours of our modern world. As the 11th century unfolded, Scandinavia itself began to change. The old gods, Odin the All-Father, Thor the Thunderer, Freya the bringer of fertility, yielded to the cross of Christ. The transformation was not instant. It came through generations of coexistence and compromise. On stone crosses carved with interlacing serpents, one can still see both faiths intertwined. Christ's figure framed by knotwork dragons, symbols of worlds not yet fully divided. The sagas tell of kings who fought and missionaries who pleaded, but the truth is deeper. The Norse spirit adapted rather than died. They accepted the new faith, yet carried forward the same fierce independence, the same reverence for fate and courage. In Iceland, this fusion became legend. The conversion came through law, not war. At the Great Althing in the year 1000, as chieftains debated the path of their people, it was agreed that all would become Christian. Yet private sacrifice to the old gods would be tolerated in secret. Thus, in the balance between belief and unity, the Icelanders chose peace. Few other nations in history have entered a new spiritual age through consensus rather than conquest. But even as the North softened under new light, the echo of its voyages continued to ripple outward. Greenland remained a fragile outpost of civilization, an experiment in endurance that lasted centuries. There, Norse farmers raised sheep and cattle on thin soil, and priests built churches from imported timber and stone. The church at Valsey still stands, its walls stark against the tundra, the last witness of a vanished colony. By the 15th century, contact faded. The sea routes froze, trade dwindled, and the people of Greenland disappeared from the chronicles. Whether they died, migrated, or were absorbed by Inuit neighbors, no one can say. Only the ruins remain. Quiet bones of a dream that had reached too far. Yet the dream itself did not die. It moved unseen through medieval Europe, carried by rumor and imagination. The sagas of Vinland, written in Iceland centuries after Leif's voyage, became tales of wonder, their reality blurred by distance. When cartographers of the Renaissance began to redraw the world, they whispered of Western lands seen by ancient Norse eyes. Some maps even bore faint marks of those memories, coasts sketched beyond Greenland, labeled with Latin echoes of Vinland. Whether the so-called Vinland map was genuine or invention, it captured a deeper truth, that the Norse had expanded the mental map of humanity, long before the world was ready to believe them. In this lies their greatest legacy. The Viking Age was not merely a chapter of raids and wars, it was a bridge between the ancient and the modern, between the tribal and the global. The Norse were among the first to think in continents, to link the cold Atlantic world into a single seaway, from the Baltic to Byzantium, from Greenland to the North American coast. Their ships, their trade routes, and their sagas wove together the first threads of a connected world. Cian, consider their craft, the longship. Its design was centuries ahead of its time, light, flexible, swift. It could ride the open sea and yet glide up rivers shallow as a man's waist. It was the first true oceanic vessel of the European world, capable of crossing both wave and continent. In its curves lay the DNA of all later exploration, the caravels of Portugal, the galleons of Spain, even the tall ships that would one day map the Pacific. The longship was not just a tool of conquest. It was a metaphor for humanity's restless heart, forever drawn toward what lies beyond. By the 12th century, Scandinavia had become part of Christendom's wider orbit. Kings replaced jarls, Latin replaced runes, cathedrals rose where wooden halls once stood. The sagas, once sung by skalds beside firelight, were written down on calfskin by monastic hands. In those manuscripts, Heimskringla, Eriks Saga Rauda, Grenlendinga Saga, the voices of a vanished age were preserved. Through them, the Viking world achieved immortality not by sword, but by story. Centuries later, archaeologists would walk among their ruins, unearthing the truth buried beneath legend. At Lanso Meadows, the Norse hearths still held charcoal and nails rusted from ship repair. In Greenland's frozen graves, the dead still wore wool woven in Iceland. And in Norway's fjords, longships slept in mounds of earth, their hulls dark as midnight, their rivets gleaming like constellations beneath the soil. The Vikings, once feared as ghosts of the sea, became ancestors of discovery. The first Europeans to touch the edge of America, the first to trace the contours of a global horizon. Yet their story is not only one of distance, but of transformation. When the Viking spirit met the vastness of the Atlantic, it encountered more than new lands. It discovered the limits of human endurance. The ocean gave and took in equal measure, offering passage to some, oblivion to others. In their struggle with that frontier, the Norse revealed something timeless: that civilization is born not in comfort, but in confrontation with the unknown. The Norse sagas rarely glorify triumph. They speak, instead of fate, of men and women who act with courage, knowing the outcome is uncertain. This fatalism, so often mistaken for despair, was in truth a form of wisdom. It accepted that greatness lies not in conquering the world, but in facing it with open eyes. When Leif Erikson set sail toward Vinland, he did not know he would reach a new continent. He simply followed the horizon, as his ancestors had done for centuries. That act, not discovery, but pursuit, is what defines the Viking heart. In the centuries that followed, new empires rose upon the maps the Vikings once ignored. Spain and Portugal reached the Indies. England circled the globe. Yet in each mast that broke the horizon, one could trace the echo of those early sails. For exploration is not an invention, it is a lineage. The Vikings stood at the dawn of that lineage, their oars dipping into the same mystery that would later drive Columbus, Magellan, and Cook. Even today, their presence endures in the lands they touched. In Iceland, the old sagas are still read, their language barely changed since the Middle Ages. In Greenland, the ruins of Norse farms lie beside Inuit camps, the bones of two worlds meeting in silence. In North America, the name Vinland survives in local legends and museum halls, a reminder that Europe's first footprint on the continent was left by men in wool and iron, not silk and gold. Their mark upon the map may have faded, but their influence runs deeper. In the human instinct to reach beyond the visible world. And so, as we trace the story of the Vikings from fjord to frontier, we glimpse a reflection of ourselves. The same winds that filled their sails fill ours. The same stars that guided their ships guide our satellites. The tools have changed, but the longing remains. The need to know what lies beyond the horizon, to move from the known to the unknown, from the secure to the infinite. Perhaps this is why the Viking story still captures us. Beneath the armor and axes lies something more enduring, a human truth. They remind us that exploration is not conquest, but communion, not escape, but encounter. To venture outward is to understand both the world and ourselves. Each voyage, each discovery, each map drawn at the edge of knowledge is a mirror held to our shared curiosity. In the modern age, when maps are complete and satellites encircle the globe, The physical unknown has grown small. Yet, the spirit of the Vikings lives wherever humanity pushes boundaries, into the depths of the ocean, the vastness of space, the uncharted territories of science and mind. Every probe sent to Mars, every telescope aimed at the dark, carries the same question that stirred those Norse hearts. What lies beyond? The Whale Road has become the Star Road. The sails are now wings of light and metal, but the story remains the same, of courage, of loss, of hope. The Vikings were not the first to dream of beyond, nor the last. They were simply those who dared when the world was still thought to end in mist and monsters. As the final echoes of the Viking oars fade into history's tide, we see their legacy not as ruin, but as foundation. They connected worlds, Europe and the Arctic, myth and map, past and future. Their journeys expanded not just geography, but imagination. And though their wooden ships have long since decayed beneath northern soil, their wake still ripples across every horizon humanity has ever crossed. Because in the end, the Viking Age was never about conquest. It was about connection. It was the moment when humanity first realized that no ocean, however vast, could confine the will to explore. From the fjords of Norway to the shores of Vinland, their story traces the first lines of a global map. A map not drawn on parchment, but in the restless human spirit that refuses to stay still. And when the last light fades over the northern sea, when the sky burns gold over the Arctic waves, and the wind whispers through empty longhouses, one truth endures, eternal as the tide, that beyond every horizon lies another world, waiting to be found.